All right, thank you all for joining. I'm going to pass this over to our moderator, Chiki. And if you would like to introduce everyone, we will get started here.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this webinar. And thanks for joining us in this session that we are going to focus on marketing yourself. My name is Chike Siguzan. I'm from Clemson University. And we have speakers from various sectors here to share their knowledge and experience with us. We have Kirk Heffelmeyer from the United States Internal Revenue Service. And we also have Sarah Needler from the Council of State Governments. And hopefully Shurab Shah will join us as we go on, from American University will join us as we go ahead. We hope that you will enjoy this session, and each of the speakers will have about 10 minutes to speak to us on this topic. And then as they are speaking, you can type in your questions in the chat, using the chat. And then eventually at the end of their speaking, we are going to take all the questions. And please feel free to type in any question you have. And I hope you enjoy this session. So I'll go ahead and invite Kirk Heffelmeyer to start this session. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. My name is Kirk Heffelmeyer. I currently work at the United States Internal Revenue Service, conveniently known as the IRS. You've probably heard about us in the news recently. I'm a social scientist there, which is a great job title. My background is not in tax administration or tax policy or anything like that. I come from more of a social science tradition. My dissertation was in public policy and about how state governments adopted or did not adopt mental health, evidence-based mental health policies. And my master's degree was in economics, and I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. So I've come kind of a long winding path to end up, doing research for the federal government at the Internal Revenue Service. And yes, the IRS does do research. We're not just a tax collection agency or a tax enforcement agency. We have quite a bit of research that goes on. Some of it is public facing. So if you've ever heard of SOI, or the Statistics of Income, that is the public facing statistical and research arm of the IRS. But there's also a lot of inward facing research, which is kind of the IRS looking at its own processes and looking at how taxpayers behave and how we can improve that interaction kind of at a customer service level and also at a return processing level, which is the area where I work in. So a lot of interesting research there. But enough about me. I'm delighted to be invited onto this panel and speak. If you attended some of these before, I in years past, I hope you found them enlightening. Since the other presenters and other invited panelists are going to speak more to the nonprofit sector or the state government sector and as well as academia, I'm going to start with just the federal process. And there's a lot to say there. The federal hiring process is neither quick nor convenient, and it is can be a real bear, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But obviously there are people who get hired into the federal government. It does work, but there is some important information that's good to know, right? And I'm more than happy to share kind of a little bit of insider knowledge about how the process works and how you can best present yourself or market yourself towards a federal job. So first I was going to talk about a little bit of the process of federal hiring. So federal hiring is largely dictated by two different kind of components. One is OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, which is the overarching federal kind of human resources or human capital office that sets a lot of the rules about how federal hiring works. And most of those rules are there to ensure fairness and consistency and to battle against nepotism or favoritism in any kind. And then the other side of it is the individual agency, cabinet department, whatever that is actually hiring you, which has its own human capital or human resources department and group that sets a lot of the rules up. But the place to always start is usajobs.gov, which is where all federal job postings initially go. They're titled in announcements. There'll be a job announcement. You can search for them. Once you have a USA Jobs account, you can set up kind of an email alert for whenever something new comes up in your search criteria. The number one thing to know about USA Jobs is be patient and be prepared to read quite a bit, because the announcements have a lot of information in them. And I recommend reading a number of them to kind of get a sense of what's the things that change, what's the thing that's specific to this announcement versus what is the information that's there in all announcements. And it's just sort of like the boilerplate information. But definitely be patient, be flexible, go into the process, understanding that it is not going to be fast, right? Most federal hiring takes on the order of months rather than weeks. And that is just unfortunately the state of where things are with federal hiring. But definitely read the announcement really carefully, read it completely until you've gotten a sense of what these announcements are like, and you can start to kind of parse out of, oh, this job announcement is looking for this kind of position, and it's maybe within this kind of subgroup or subdirectorate in this agency, rather than that's the same paragraph that shows up in every single announcement from that agency. There is a template that you can start typing in your information that will build a federal resume for you. I do and don't recommend it. I do recommend it in the sense that I think you should start there and look at the kinds of information that that's asking you for, to get a sense of what are the pieces of information that is of interest according to OPM for these different federal positions. Why I don't recommend using it is it doesn't really allow you to specify or personalize kind of what you are after or what you want to highlight for that individual position, right? Because you can set up you can go through the resume builder and build your federal resume and then just blankly apply it to every single announcement that you put out. And I think that's all well and good, but different jobs, you're going to want to highlight different pieces of information to specify or to really market, like what are the skills or what makes you interested in and appropriate for that position. And so instead of going through the federal resume builder every single time for all those different announcements, I think it's fine to start there, look at the kind of information that federal jobs are interested in, and then go from there and build your own. Cover letters is another area. I don't know if we specifically called it out in the webinar, but you'll often see in federal announcements that a cover letter is optional. And the answer to that is yes and no. For lower graded level positions, more entry level positions, a cover letter can be optional. But if you're starting with an undergraduate, especially a master's degree or higher, a cover letter becomes more mandatory. The announcement may label it as optional, but not including a cover letter is a signal that maybe you didn't spend as much time on this application package, and maybe that signals that you're really not interested in. Because one strategy that people take with federal hiring is just, all opportunity is there and just click all the buttons and apply to everything you can think of. And that's a strategy. And unfortunately, there is a degree to which, it's a little bit about numbers, but I don't recommend that strategy. I would say look at a lot of announcements, keep your mind open. Maybe it's not the agency you were thinking of, but it's the right kind of job. Maybe it's the right kind of job, but not, the agency. Be flexible there, but definitely specify and personalize every application package you put in, because eventually some real human person is going to look at that and they can tell if this is just copy pasted, that you've sent out 100 times. And the last thing I'll say about the federal process is the hardest thing is getting your first federal job, because there's a lot of waiting and nuance and just sometimes baffling information that's included in the announcement that doesn't really tell you the kinds of information you want to know. But once you're inside and have a federal job, it all becomes a lot clearer and makes a lot more sense. So be very patient with, getting into the federal service. Specifically about resumes, the announcement will probably mention specific things about what the job entails. And sometimes they'll be specifically labeled as KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Sometimes they won't. If they are, it becomes a lot easier. If they're not, you can sometimes read between the lines and make sure your resume and or cover letter speaks to those. They're looking for people with certain knowledge, skills, and abilities. Make sure that your resume and cover letter reflects that. A controversial thing is about resume length for federal hiring. One school of thought says there's no such thing as a too short federal resume, in the sense that just put everything, because probably there's going to be a computer reviewing the applications before a human ever sees it, and you need to make sure those keywords are in there. And the more keywords, or the more you can try to cover your bases, the better. That's a strategy. Some people do it. I don't recommend it. I think a more concise resume that's tailored to the announcement is a better way to go. You can still get those keywords in there, but you're not just throwing, darts at the dartboard and hoping for the best. But definitely, things that are older in your career path or things that aren't as relevant, they don't necessarily have to be on there. I wouldn't. Leaving a gap in your employment records sometimes can not look great, but you don't need to go into a whole lot of detail about a job you had 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, right? Just position and maybe a few details. Definitely don't cut and paste job descriptions. So it's really easy to tell when you're describing the kinds of things you did at your old job versus, cutting and pasting from the job announcement that you applied to some years ago, getting that job. It doesn't tell the person who's reading that resume what you actually did. It just describes kind of what the job was, which is a distinction. Definitely have someone else look over your resumes and cover letters. Second pair of eyes is great. Definitely edit, and review and spell check and all of those things. The last little bit, and I apologize, I'm not looking at the clock, so I apologize to go over a little bit on my time, but for the interview process, it can be difficult, but try to learn about the agency, and if you can, the kind of sub-agency or subgroup that you're actually going to be working for. Just look in the news. Have they come up in the news recently? What's on their website? A lot of federal stuff can be really opaque, and some places don't really advertise much information, but try your best to find out what's going on, because that's going to allow you to ask intelligent questions, which is going to show that you're both engaged with the process and that you're actually interested in the job, and not just, oh, I want a federal job and this announcement came up. So definitely think in advance and maybe even role play or practice interviews. Interview questions tend to fall around the same topics over and over again. You can probably type into Google, the job title and interview questions and come up with something. Somebody's probably going to ask you about, like, name a challenge you faced and how you overcame it. Name a time you worked in a group, and how did that go? And when you do get those kinds of questions, make sure to answer the question, and sometimes even think, what's the question behind the question, right? So if somebody asks you about working in a team, it's not necessarily about, like, what did the team achieve, but like, how did you actually interact in a group and how did the team work together? It's perfectly fine to ask interviewers to clarify or to repeat a question, especially in the federal process where it's maybe a panel interview of 2 to 3 people. It's becoming more rare to have single person interviews. You know, it's sometimes can be hard to tell over the phone of who's, you know, who's going, but definitely show your engagement and prepare in advance. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirk. I know that when we were talking, you're the federal government and everything, we could spend the whole day talking about it, and wonderful questions in the chats. Please keep them coming in the question and answer feature, using the question and answer feature. Now we want to move over almost like the opposites to Sarah to talk about from the nonprofit perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheeky. And thanks, Kurt. That was great advice already. And happy to be here with you all. My name is Sarah, and I'm joining from the Council of State Governments. And Council of State Governments, I had it listed as nonprofit and state government because we are a nonprofit organization, but we're a little bit different in that we're also a membership association with all 50 states. So states are actually paying dues to the Council of State Governments, or CSG, and then we provide services in the form of research, policy analysis, also a lot of convenings and conferences to bring policymakers together to learn from each other. So that's why I'm here kind of with the perspective both of nonprofit and state government, as well as having worked in state government myself previously. So with CSG, and I'm happy if anyone's interested to talk more about it, but won't go into too much detail right now. I work with our research team. So it's the team that specifically is looking at, you know, the data behind all of the policy analysis and work that the Council of State Governments does. Previously, and I'm just sharing this because I think it might be relevant to the perspective that I'm bringing here today, is I also worked for Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA, in Ghana. I know if some of you all are more familiar with JPOW, IPA is a sister organization that does more work internationally than domestically, as well as worked on a UNICEF-funded surveys looking at education in Syria, and then have also worked, like I mentioned, in state government, and that was in South Carolina. So kind of a mix of experiences in a few different roles, just to give you some context of where I'm coming from. And another thing I wanted to share is that I actually am here with you. I know most of you are coming to this conversation and wanting to learn from the perspective of having a PhD, which I actually don't have. I have a master's in economics and then an MPA in international development. And really, I'm just excited about that translation of research to policy and making sure that research is really informed by questions that policymakers are interested in. So again, just wanted to share that context and then also let you all know that even though I have not searched with a PhD for jobs, I have hired and do work with several folks who do have PhDs. So also asked for their input and we chatted a little bit, and I'm bringing some of their perspectives here with me as well. All right, so I wrote down a few notes and I want to make sure I cover some of those. So forgive me if I'm looking at the screen a little bit. But the first thing I wanted to mention was I think it's really important when going into the job search to make sure you're clear on what type of job you're actually looking for. So when you're thinking about federal government versus state government versus nonprofit, think tank, or academia, these are all very different in a lot of ways. So they're really the type of organization is really going to make a difference in terms of what the role looks like. And that's going to vary pretty substantially, potentially, between those different types of organizations. So even though I know you might be willing to look at multiple types of organizations, or maybe you're interested in both federal government and or state government, but I think it's really important to understand from the beginning what some of those differences are between the different types of organizations, and then be able to really target what you're looking for. I think another reason for that is also because I would say, and I'll talk about this a little bit for nonprofits and state government, but I think the approach to how you apply and even find some of these positions is going to vary quite a bit based off of the type of organization as well. So for nonprofit versus state government, I was trying to think about what I see as the core differences in those roles. And I would say for a nonprofit, how that changes or is a little bit different from the other types of organizations is that in a nonprofit position, you're often going to be asked to play a role besides just researcher. So even if you're hired as a research analyst, researcher specifically, data scientist, whatever the actual title of the role is. With nonprofits, oftentimes you're going to be asked to do a lot of things outside that typical scope of what we consider a researcher to be. So that might be things like writing short articles. It might be, probably will be a lot of grant writing, not necessarily even research specific grant writing, but grant writing for the organization as a whole. Sometimes more policy analysis that's not always kind of what we consider as rigorous analysis or rigorous research. And so an example, what I mean there is our research team a lot of times get from state policymakers what we often refer to as research requests. But then those research requests, a lot of times when you think about it, aren't what we would necessarily define as research. It might be a question like, what are state policies around sustainability? And so it would be conducting a 50-state scan to see what legislation has been passed around sustainability, maybe looking at what state level agencies have sustainability officers. So kind of the realm and definition of research is going to be a little bit different for nonprofits. And I think that even depends on the nonprofit itself as well. So I know with CSG, that definition is very broad, whereas when I worked for IPA, that definition was a little bit more defined because they are specifically looking at RCTs of social programs. So that definition of research maybe is like the more traditional type of research, at least in my mind. So we just wanted to make that clarification for nonprofits. And then for state governments, I think one of the huge benefits is that you are going to have direct access to policymakers, not only to policymakers, but also to funding and to data. So that is very exciting, I imagine, to a lot of us. But then I wanted to also make sure to, I guess, share that one way I think it's a little bit more limiting is that sometimes your role is going to be more defined. So it's going to be potentially more difficult to step outside of the things that are listed in your job description. It might be a little bit more difficult to get the state to think about and then to implement a new program based off research. And again, these are all my specific experiences, which may not be true in all cases, but that's kind of how I see state government being slightly different than the nonprofit role. So with that being said, I think there are also different approaches to getting jobs in nonprofit and state government roles. For nonprofit, and this actually was one of those recommendations that came from my coworkers when I was chatting with them, is for nonprofits, networking is a pretty big key. And I know this was actually a question we'll probably get to later for around federal government, but I know for nonprofits, that's super important. As a hiring manager, a lot of times we're actually going through and reading each individual resume. And if someone is telling me, oh, my friend applied or somebody is referred directly, I will always have a first 15-minute phone call conversation with them. So it's really important to network. That can really be your chance to get in the door and make yourself kind of set apart from other candidates, and oftentimes make it through the first kind of initial phase of the hiring process. And then my coworker also said that, a lot of times training, and he said in his PhD program, there was no training on how to network or how to talk to people. And so really wanted to share the advice of spend more time talking to people and less time worrying so much about the details of your resume or your application materials. And again, might depend a bit on the job and the organization type, but I think that's something that maybe applies a little bit more to nonprofits than some of the other organizations. For state governments, that I would say is probably the best way to approach that would be to find a specific agency that focuses on research and or hires researchers or data scientists. So state government is huge. There's so many different places you could plug into state government, which feels like it can be a little bit overwhelming. But if you're able to find which are the agencies that are really invested in, let's say, evidence-based policy making, they're going to be the ones who are going to be hiring for researchers. And so those are really the good places to look. So really do your research in terms of what agencies might be interested in researchers, where those opportunities might be. And then another way you could approach state government is through working with a organization that kind of works hand in hand with government. So that would be something like working for the Council of State Governments, or maybe working for JPAL that does a lot of work hand in hand with policymakers. I actually, when I first started working for the state of South Carolina, started as a fellow through the Harvard Kennedy School has a government performance lab. I'm not sure if you all have talked to folks from there yet, but I actually started as a fellow through that program, working with South Carolina state government. And then after the fellowship ended, stayed on as a full-time staff. And so that was another way to get plugged into state government in a way that state government wasn't already kind of traditionally set up to have a researcher type role. And then I have just a few more other things I want to mention of just kind of more general advice. The first thing, and I kind of thought about when I was thinking about advice to share with you all, was that you all are very intimidating. And I know that sounds strange. And I know this was something that was very difficult for me to even wrap my head around the first time somebody told me that I was intimidating in the workplace, because I'm like, how could I possibly be perceived as an intimidating person? But coming as somebody with a strong academic background, with a PhD, possibly coming from a like very reputable school, I think a lot of times folks, especially in state government and nonprofit, might be like a little bit intimidated or a little bit hesitant. They want to make sure that you are down to earth, you're going to be able to connect with people in a very personal way, and that you're going to be a team player. I think the reason why I wanted to mention this is because I think a lot of times we're trying to prove like, oh, I'm really smart. Let me give you my CV, all my publications and that sort of thing. But that's not, that's already kind of assumed when I'm coming to your application from a nonprofit perspective is, oh, they have a PhD. I already know they're smart. They've already done some publications. I know that. And so what I'm looking for in those applications to set you apart would be that I know how to apply these skills. I'm flexible, willing to do things beyond just research technical writing, if that makes sense. The second piece of advice is to market your skills and your willingness and excitement to be able to do things besides research. And some of this advice also came from some of my coworkers as well, as really in your application or resume to highlight how you're able to actually apply your research and how you're able to present that research. So really translating research into action and into being able to share results in a way that people are going to understand, even if they don't have any technical expertise. That being said, with the resume is also making sure to really cater it to the job requirements or announcements. And I know this is something that Kurt mentioned as well. But the first question that I always ask in interviews is, what do you know about CSG? And you would be very surprised at how many people are applying to a job and have told you that they're excited to work for the organization, but then when you ask them, really have no idea of what they're applying to. So I think that's a really big thing to keep in mind when you're approaching the interview process. And then also making sure to keep it short, which I know Kurt also alluded to, but especially I think nonprofit world, we're never going to expect a long list of publications. Make it 2 pages. Even if you do have publications that could go on for 10 pages, I think putting a handful of them, or maybe having them all listed on LinkedIn or on your website and then having that linked, that's a much better way for me to be able to very quickly look through your resume, be impressed and be interested. And then the last piece I wanted to make sure to mention is it's okay not to have a lot of experience. So oftentimes I think being a student, maybe a PhD student that's gone, directly from college to a PhD program, I think there can be some, hesitancy or worry that during the interview process, there might be questions asking about whether or not you have completed a certain task or done a certain thing or managed people. And it's okay, I think, that you don't have to focus on having done those tasks before. I think it's really important to really focus on the skills that you are bringing. And you do have a lot of skills coming from a PhD program: research, writing, speaking, analytical skills, even organizational skills and task management are really important things that I think you can emphasize in the interview process. And one thing I'll just leave you with is, my coworker, when I asked again for their advice on what to share, they said that low experience and high skill outweighs high experience and low skill. And he said, like, this is every time. So I think just really emphasizing on the skills that you do have and can bring is a great way to go. With that, I will turn things back to Cheeky.
Enlightened here. We've just covered federal government, nonprofits, and state governments. Thank you, Sarah, for all that you have, and I know there are many questions for you. And yeah, we have the opportunity to go to the academic side with Professor Saurabh Shah. Welcome, Professor. You can unmute yourself and go ahead, sir. You're still muted.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can hear me now. All right.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I decided to participate because, so in terms of academic, I'm actually currently a Master of Public Policy student, and I am set to graduate this December. So what I can do here is sort of, give my perspective, both as a student of public policy who has, done some internship opportunities through academics and using the career resources, and also as a recruiter. So prior to grad school, I was working as a recruiter mostly for tech startups. And it was, a very eye-opening experience. So basically, Sarah and Kirk have offered some amazing strategies for both the government and the nonprofit. So I would say I transitioned from being in the recruiting field in the tech space and going into, government and policy. So when I first started off, I was initially a little nervous about, my transition from how will I be able to make a successful transition? I don't have any, prior experience in government and policy aside from getting a poli-sci degree. So what I did was when I first started last spring of 2021, my first position was a research assistant where I, worked closely with a professor on issues related to representation and the environment and crowdsourcing and technology policy issues. And from that opportunity, I think one strategy I would say is like whatever you're working on, just make sure you excel in it and, make a good first impression. That's what I did with my professors. I worked really hard on the project, and then eventually she, recommended me to another opportunity where I got to work with a professor he was creating a blog and he was working with people from places like the UN. So I had from one opportunity basically led me to another. So that I would say is the power of networking, really leverage your connections you have with, your professors, both the ones you take classes with and the ones you do research with. They are at American University. I've had professors who worked at the FBI for decades who have, long and distinguished careers in government, nonprofit, and, they're bringing a wealth of expertise and connections. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Also, the Career Research Center was really helpful at American University for, sort of guiding me through resumes. I think Kirk talked a lot about the federal resume, so I won't go into that. But what I learned from resumes, both as a candidate and as a student, is, really talk about numbers. I think numbers really illustrate, results. So, if you helped, increase, like say you're a social media coordinator and you increase viewership by 32%, write that down and talk about, what, if you're doing a research project and you presented it and it helped in some way, talk about what the results were over there. So I think tangible results can really go a long way. And for every job posting you apply to, make sure you read the job description, and don't get discouraged if you don't meet all the requirements of the role. I think with internships and at the student level, they obviously won't have all the qualifications, but really just try to emphasize your interest and what you bring to the table. Like, look at the job description and get the gist of it. And if you have like the main skill sets, really talk about those. Or if you feel like you aren't really strong in a particular skill, like say if it's a data skill, like I've applied for roles with like Stata and R, and I've barely had much experience with that, but just say, you're willing to learn and sort of emphasize that portion of it. I think that definitely goes a long way. And while you're doing an interview, always know about the organization, do that beforehand, because if you don't, that's huge turnoff. And whenever I was asked, tell me about yourself, I would always just walk through my experience and, sort of in a narrative style. So, and also, tailor your answer to the position. So if this is a nonprofit about, say environment, for example, you can talk about, even if you don't have experience with any environmental organizations, maybe talk about a club that you're in, or maybe talk about, the position itself and how your prior experience sort of ties into that. And just, maybe talk about the social and economic impacts that climate change is having, and maybe you had an internship with like, a minority resource center, talk about the impact of the environment on minorities. So really be creative in how you you express yourself, share your experience, and really tie it in with the organization's mission and what you can bring to the table. So that has definitely helped. I was also very fortunate as a student to have a really good, I think for me, an advantage is being in DC, which is why I picked American University, just so you have a lot of opportunities literally in your backyard. All the nonprofits, private sector places related to policy is right there. So really, and also I'm in my late 20s, and initially I thought it would be, a little embarrassing to be, a much older person at an internship where you have people who are a lot younger than you. So I think the way I sort of frame it is you're gaining experience, and it's never too late to pick up things and whatnot. So I mean, during my time in grad school, I've been fortunate to have internship with U.S. News and World Report and National Association of Counties, and also a trade association that focuses on technology policy. So really, I'm really just expressing, I'm really just talking from the perspective of a master's student who is, transitioning. When you saw academic, I thought many of you might mean, oh, okay, I'm a PhD, who is looking for like professors or being a researcher on campus. I am just really a student who is just sort of, I'm in the shoes of a lot of students at APPAM and whatnot. So yeah, that's right. I do have a lot of recruiting experience as well. And what I'll say is, I think whenever I have conducted interviews as a recruiter, I really do pick up on the person's, not only their technical skills, but also just how passionate they are about the company. And I think, especially like if you're late into your career, you want somebody who is, going to stick with your organization, for a long term and grow within the organization. So I think we definitely look for that. I always love to ask people about, your professional skills and whatnot. So that was, during my time as a recruiter. So, all right. I really enjoyed being a part of this panel. I've never been a panelist before, so I was a little nervous, but I'm really glad I got this opportunity and sort of share things from the perspective of someone who is just learning and growing from their experience. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, and I think your perspective also adds to all the conversations we are having. And we have just about 15 minutes to round off this program, this webinar. And we have some questions, and some of those questions where the panelists are going to tackle them. And I will start with Kirk. You have some questions that you can speak to.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, looking down through the list here, I'll try to handle these quickly. So the first one was, are international students allowed to work for federal or state government? So in general, for the federal government, the answer is no. Most federal positions are open only to US citizens or lawful permanent residents. There are some small exceptions for hard to fill positions, usually related to foreign language skills or some other difficult to fill positions. But in general, the answer is no, unfortunately. For USA jobs, is there an easy way to tell which job postings are most suitable, especially interested in a particular degree? Degree level, yes. So typically entry-level positions, you can tell by the GS level. GS stands for general schedule. So most federal positions follow the general schedule, which is a pay schedule that goes from 1 to 15. Entry level for undergraduates is sometimes GS 7-ish. PhD or masters, it's usually around GS 9, and PhDs, it's usually GS 11. So you can kind of tell by salary range in the GS level kind of what degree level, but particular degree is tougher. A lot of announcements will say that they need a degree in a certain area, or they'll say, especially around the more technical, that you need so many credit hours of math or so many credit hours in some computer science, related area or something. There's not necessarily an easy way to tell just by the job title. Some of them are obvious, like economist. A lot of them are not. Some of them, a lot of things fall under what is the job series 343, which is management and program analysts. There's a lot of them in the federal government. They do a lot of different things, but that job title doesn't really tell you the academic area or the focus. And that word analyst gets used a lot of ways. So is there an easy way? Not really. But again, once you start reading some of these announcements, you can start to get a feel for what's interesting or what's applicable. Next question was, what role does networking play in getting a federal government job? The process is almost entirely designed not to have a role for networking. That doesn't mean that there isn't, but it's designed intentionally for that not to happen, right? It's supposed to be an incredibly fair and judicious process that is deliberately broken up across multiple decision makers so that nobody can just say, oh, I like that person, let me bring them on. However, networking can really help you learn. It can help you learn about specifically what agencies do, what agencies are looking for, what different types of jobs are out there. And especially once you get your first federal job, networking can really help you learn about, like, oh, that group does something really interesting, I'd like to work there. And especially for temporary opportunities or specific details, like, oh, I want to go, on a detail and work somewhere for 6 weeks, that can really help. But in general, I wouldn't invest a lot of time networking if you're trying to get your first federal job. I think the next one's about state governments. So
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Sarah, please, can you go ahead and take on some of those questions that I shared with you?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'll start with the one that Kurt answered for federal government jobs, but are they open to international students? I would say, unfortunately, that's also for state government particularly, generally no. That being said, I can't 100% say that is the case for all states and all agencies. I imagine there are some exceptions, but it's probably going to be the case where if they can't find a candidate who already has permission to work in the US, that might be the case when they're going to start opening it up to international applicants. I think, though, one way to potentially still get involved and still work with state government as an international student would be to work with one of those nonprofit organizations that do work alongside state governments. And unfortunately, CSG also at most of our positions would require authorization to work in the US to apply. it would be the case where there would be a special exception if an international student was the best candidate for that particular position. And that's typically going to be higher level director positions. But I would say, I know there are a lot of programs that do allow international applicants to work with state governments. I think one of those examples, and again, not 100% sure, but I'm sure the fellowship program that I mentioned that I did to start working in state government through the Harvard Kennedy School. I know there are a few students there who were international applicants and then were able to do a fellowship, and they were basically embedded in state government. They just were employed by this organization, in the case, actually the university. So that's a good way to kind of navigate that problem with state government. And I can look into that a little bit more and maybe share out of organizations that would allow for international applicants, because I'm curious about that myself. The other question I saw in the chat is around specific skills that you would be advertising beyond translational research. I'm assuming this is from more of the nonprofit perspective, but I think this also applies to state government as well. One of the big ones I would say is writing. And again, that's going to depend, but being able to write to a non-technical audience is a huge one. So research writing is a very specific type of writing. When you get to the workplace, oftentimes that's not the type of writing that you're going to be doing unless you are in academia or you are writing a research paper. But most of the time, that's not going to be the case. A lot of times it's going to be briefs, blogs, articles. So having that skill is very important. I would say also, to the extent that you're able to get grant writing experience, that's something that's super valuable as well. And that's something I think you can easily ask for or be able to try to get that experience through internships. Always try to let our CSG interns get experience with that, because I know it's really important. And I think those are probably the two big ones. I'll leave it at that and let us answer some of the other questions.
Yeah, Sarah, you can go ahead and also speak to the question that asks if there are needs, foreign language experience requirements or needs in the market.
Good question. When thinking about this question from like an international perspective, so obviously if it's an NGO in the US, probably not as much need. Probably if it is here, Spanish, but I'm not sure, I'm not sure about that. I would say if you're looking at jobs internationally with NGOs or even US NGOs that are functioning abroad, I think a lot of French. So that was actually a big struggle for me when I was working abroad, was I don't speak French. And then actually when you're looking at things abroad, Spanish is actually hard because there are a lot of just native Spanish speakers that are already qualified for those jobs, right? So they're not going to hire me who speaks broken Spanish. So I think French, if you're looking internationally, is really a high demand language, and then maybe Spanish domestically.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question about, I know we didn't really cover that, about the academia, if teaching a course as an instructor, if it's the most important. I think I can mention here that teaching hours gives you an advantage if you want to go into academia, if you want to be tenure tracked, and it's essential that you have those teaching hours and all, but also essential that you have your research experience, publications in reputable journals. That is essential, that you're also connected to the network of professors and researchers that are in that space, and make sure, just like we are having the next APPAM conference in November, that you attend those kind of conferences where you meet academia and stuff. So it's essential you have those teaching hours. Some programs will actually specify the number of teaching hours they might require to show evidence that you can actually teach. So I think it's an important, but whether it's the most important, it may not be the most important, but it's actually an important requirement. I think Kirk can also add something to this. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I've worked as an adjunct and have been in academia for a while, and I agree with everything there. It's just It also depends on what kind of institution you're applying for. Is this a primarily undergrad liberal arts, granting degree program, or is this a, quote unquote R1 research, institution? And they're going to vary on how, how they weigh out the teaching side versus the research side. But definitely having teaching experience. Most applications these days require you to write a teaching statement or some kind of statement about your approach to teaching and pedagogy. So definitely important, but I wouldn't say it's the most important. But again, it varies on what kind of institution you're applying for.
All right. As we quietly get to the end of this workshop, want to have some comments from Shurab, sorry, before we round up. Yes, you're muted.
Oh yeah, I'm here. So final comments or
Yes, please.
yeah. So I would say just don't be afraid to try different things. I think in grad school, for me, what I discovered in terms of internships is you don't necessarily need to have a focus in the beginning. I mean, try different organizations, do like, community health program or join like in a nonprofit or, there's this cool program called the Virtual Student Foreign Services, which I did in grad school, where I was placed at a government agency for about a year, focusing on traffic safety. I even worked with a major news organization doing product research over there. So I think there's something to gain from all sorts of experiences, even though it may not necessarily be the subject area you want to focus on after graduation and in the workforce. And I think, every organization teaches you something.
Thank you, sir. Can we have final words from Kirk?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And just definitely, especially when you're first starting out, any door is the right door, and you can always learn something. And, I think there was one question about, if you're an international student, you want to stay in the US after your degree program, internships, NGOs, smaller organizations can be a great way to get your foot in the door and get started. So, federal, it's a high hurdle, but, start where you are.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sure. I guess last thought for y'all would be, don't hesitate to reach out to people. I did so much LinkedIn stalking when I was first looking for a job, and still do when I'm thinking about new jobs. And you'd be surprised at the number of people who will actually respond and take their time to talk to you. And even just that information gathering, I think, is super important to be able to understand an organization, understand the role. Even if it's not specifically for networking purposes, just having those connections, gathering that information, finding the people on LinkedIn who have the job that you want, and then reaching out to them, I think is really, it seems intimidating to do that, but it's definitely worth it. And I know when I get those messages, I'm always happy to help, because most of us have been in that same place looking for a job. And so we're happy to help. So that's it for me.
Thank you. And I want to really appreciate and thank all the panelists for sparing their time and sharing their experiences. Yeah, but I want to also let every person know that on the 24th we are going to be having another panel session, and we are going to be looking at navigating the current job market. Also, remember that we have the conference, the big conference in November. If you've not yet registered, registration is open. Please go and register now. And I want to also appreciate every person that attended. You all made this webinar as a great success. And we know that as we go ahead and move forward, we'll have better experiences. Thank you for coming, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.